Hello and welcome to this video collection on the basics of warm-ups. Today we're going to talk a lot about different exercises, how they're useful, what ways we can modify them to make them serve us best for our future singing, and a little bit more about things that we can do in order to make sure that our practice sessions go as successfully as possible. This first video is going to cover a couple different topics to help you prepare for your exercises. So let's go right into it. One of the first things that we like to do as singers is identify and perfect our pitch. That is surprisingly tricky, and I think a lot of people assume that you're just able to sing on pitch, and I kind of disagree there. I think it's a learned skill. So the question would be, how do you start to learn how to better your pitch? One of the ways that I always encourage people to do that is to practice envisioning the pitch in their head. And what I mean by this is you'll hear a pitch, let it go into your ear, and take that sound into the brain and kind of sit in that sound for a second. Really give yourself a chance to isolate the different colors you hear and whether or not you think it's high or low and all these other different elements before you begin to try and sing. After you've thought about it for a second and really gotten yourself oriented around this pitch, then you're ready to start singing. From there, we try and place it into the physical. This is kind of tricky because it's not like we can see the instrument that we're using. The voice is deep into our throat. So when we're trying to access an understanding of how to make a pitch happen, I like to feel for it a little bit more than listen for it. And I know that sounds totally bananas, but when we are relying on our ears, sometimes it's not as honest as we'd like it to be, and I end up trusting more how my throat feels when creating a pitch. It allows me to be a bit more accurate, because if I'm in a larger space or a smaller space, that might change how my ear hears myself. If I'm singing louder or softer, that might change how I end up perceiving my own pitch. So what ends up being most reliable is how the pitch feels. This is one of my personal favorite exercises, and I do it all the time. I do it on various vowels, I do it on various consonants, and sometimes I make it longer with multiple pitches, or I just play a single pitch at a higher speed to increase the challenge. But either way, this exercise is one where you will repeat what you hear on the piano. I will play it, I will then sing it for you, then I will play a pitch again, and then you will sing it. This exercise is designed to try and speed up your pitch recognition skills. So don't worry if you fall behind. You can always pause this video and rewind and try again. But let's give it a shot, shall we? So the next thing that makes this a little bit harder is to identify whether or not your note that you're singing this time is higher or lower than the previous note. And it's not like you're necessarily having to tell anyone what you really think, but it's mostly just for you to keep in mind as you're going through this exercise. Am I singing a note that is higher or lower than the previous note that I sang? This kind of thought helps to really orient your brain and the anatomy on how they're going to access pitches together. You have to collaborate both the physical and the mental to be able to accomplish pitch. Like I mentioned before, a way that I like to challenge myself with this particular exercise is just increasing the speed. So instead of me hitting the note, singing it, hitting the note and asking you, I'm just going to play the note. And I'm going to go pretty quickly, and we can see how you feel about reacting without too much information. We can see how well you do with those kinds of challenges. So I'm going to play a pitch, you will go. Play a pitch, you will go. And if you want to really challenge yourself, you can always speed up this video and increase it to maybe 1.25 speed. But until then, let's try this one. So, are you ready? Let's try this out. Good. Whew. That was really quick. Nice work. So the idea is being able to hear a pitch and give it back without too much thinking. But don't worry if that second exercise was a little bit tricky. You can always work up to it. Make sure that you spend more of your time working on the previous one just so you can really think about pitch accuracy and pitch recognition. This previous exercise really shows another concept that's kind of important for us to discuss, is recognizing and then preparing for high or low notes. If you really think about it, most of our day is spent in a pretty narrow range. That's largely the pitches that we use when we're talking. And as a result, that area seems to be pretty comfortable for a lot of beginner singers and advanced singers alike. When we go into the more extremes of our range, that's when we start to see people get a little bit anxious. I think a lot of people are prepared for the higher range to feel a little scary because we kind of conceptually know that it's more intimidating. But then it's not usually until people are asked to sing in the low range that they realize just how tricky that one is too. It's got the same problem, right? If you don't spend much time in it, you're not going to feel as comfortable in it. And just like you don't talk like this to all your friends, you don't talk like this either. So in these extremes, we have to kind of prepare ourselves to sing in those areas with both confidence and accuracy, something that is kind of under-discussed and we can absolutely work on. When preparing for high notes, I like to make sure that people remember you don't have to worry too much about the actual words that you may or may not be singing. When we get really high, most people try to make those words happen and it ends up making their job a little harder. Some vowels are just better in the top range than others, and I find for me, it tends to be very, very similar shapes, if you can hear that. They are not very different, but just with a lot of schwa. Schwa is a sound, a very neutral vowel, and it's found in a lot of different languages and written many different ways. If you wanted to use the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA, it would be an upside down E. You might have seen it before, but I like to think about it a lot in my higher range. That way I can really round any vowel and it doesn't get too tinny or metallic sounding. And what that means for me is if it goes yeah, very, very bright up there. When we go into that higher range, we do have a bit of a tendency to narrow everything, and that can be very tricky to make some of those higher notes sound pretty and comfortable. Best way to solve that problem is just throw a little schwa in there and it'll warm it right up. So what does that look like? Well, I'm going to start us about here. You can use whatever range feels most comfortable for you, and we're going to go up about 5 pitches. And as we go up, I want you to think about how much space the back of your mouth in particular needs. As I open that ending note, I find the back of my jaw kind of separating a little bit, almost like I'm about to yawn. And you can even see down here, my tongue, this is like the base of my tongue and the bottom of my throat, is kind of opening, almost like a bit of a bullfrog action. If you watch the inside of my mouth, you might notice a little bit of a U shape in my tongue. That extra U shape just creates additional place for the air and the sound to resonate. If I don't do that and I go like this, you can see there's a little bit of tension here, and the sound is not quite as round and not quite as warm. I have to work a little bit harder to make that top note sound okay, but even then it just sounds a little tense. That color for me feels like it's coming from a similar space in which I speak normally. So if I were to speak here and I just kind of increase this pitch and I go like this and I continue up higher, it just sounds a little bit narrow, like this. Very, very tight. Whereas if I were to think a little bit more lifted and open, almost like I'm getting ready for a fancy tea party, and I go, oh my goodness, up we go. Just that little extra space makes a huge difference on the color. And that is how I like to prepare a little bit for my higher notes, is thinking about shape, thinking about keeping the mouth nice and open, and letting my tongue create that gentle little divot. I like to also think about that breath being nice and relaxed. If I push too much air, it will end up cracking. So we also want to think about just using a little bit less air the higher we go. That will help prevent additional instability and tension. We don't want to feel like we're pushing. So always try and keep in mind mouth shape, tongue shape, breath pressure, and don't worry too much about the words. Then what about going down low, you might be thinking. When I go down low, I have to think a lot about placement as well. This time though, instead of going for big open back, I'm actually placing the sound a little bit more forward. Not in my nose, I'm not going like this, but I'm placing it almost like here, as if I'm putting it in my sinuses, which obviously is not physically possible, but it's what I imagine in my head. This placement a little bit forward helps me to keep these pitches from sagging too deep into the chest and getting lost. That extra nasality keeps it a little brighter, and it makes it sound a little bit more similar to my middle and higher ranges. So we can go down and try this out. So I could go, and if I isolate it, I feel my tongue kind of pressing down into my throat, and then as a result, the sound gets a little bit soft and airy. The way I fight that is to almost think like a little smile and keep that color up. I'm thinking about how it relates to the middle of my voice. So now I can compare the two directly. You can hear that second one, the note just sounds a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more excited. And that's coming from me thinking about that placement going right up here instead of going into the chest. Even though the chest can feel quite nice because it vibrates very pleasantly, it's not always the most ideal sound for the audience because it just gets a little bit soft. And the other bonus of having the position be a little bit more forward in the face is that I can transition into my middle range and higher range with a little bit more ease because it's more similar. And I can show you this. Versus this second one just feels like it's not quite as connected, and it feels like I have two different people singing. The soft, airy, gentle, low version mixed with this bright, powerful, high version. And I would rather have it sound like one cohesive voice from start to finish. And now we've spent a little bit of time in all these different areas of the voice. It's kind of fascinating how even as you are beginning to look at these different skills, they are pretty complicated and they have a lot of different things going on. This video is by no means an exhaustive explanation of what we have to do as singers, but it's at least something that allows you to think a little bit on your own and figure out where you might have things that are really excellent skills that you're really proud of and things that you might want to work on a little bit more. But before we go on to the exercises, I really want to impress upon you the importance of confidence. When we make mistakes, which we will because we all do, we want to make sure that they don't completely derail our exercises. Exercises are going to be a little imperfect. They're gonna sometimes sound a little silly or maybe sound a little rough. You are always able to rewind and retry. Don't think that you have to just barrel through it or keep on going. My goal for these videos is to make sure you have all the time you need in order to navigate this successfully and feel like you've really gotten something out of this. So even though you might feel a little bit scared or nervous, I would love for you to give every exercise a good shot. And you can also figure out which set of exercises you feel the most comfortable with, whether it's the first one or the last one or something in between. Feel free to use these exercises as you like and hopefully build up your confidence for when you're ready to start actually singing some beautiful songs. That's it for my introduction. I don't want to keep you here too much longer, so let's just jump right into some of these exercises.